So I'm Jean Harris, and the title of my talk is Political Illiteracy and Government by and for Career Politicians. And I'm going to go back to the 1700s as opposed to 1970s. In 1788, James Madison said, if men were angels, government would not be necessary. And I think Madison really meant men, not men and women. And he probably also meant white men. But that's a talk for another day. Obviously, men and women are not angels, and so government is indeed necessary. Madison went on to say, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So 228 years later, we are still working under the government structures that Madison really gave us. A federal system of government, we have state and national governments trying to protect our rights, branches of government check each other. And so our government is still the same system, but obviously there are some problems. So is our system of government able to control the governed? Many would say it's too controlling of the governed. Is it able to control itself? More and more Americans are saying it's not able to control itself. And so Americans think our political system is dysfunctional. They don't trust the government officials. They feel alienated from government. Some talk about not trusting their peer citizens to make wise decisions when they go vote or when they're involved in politics. There's even a group of people calling for a new constitutional convention. The system's so broken we need a constitutional convention. Now, the last time we had a constitutional convention, way back when, in 1787, we threw out the Constitution. We had the Articles of Confederation had only been our Constitution for about 7 years, and it was thrown out and replaced by a whole new document. And that's the document that we still really function under. As a political scientist, I think that the problems, polarization, this great media we have, lots of transparent information, needs to be handled well. And to me, part of the solutions to our problems is education. So civic education, education to make our voters and our public officials more knowledgeable, more politically literate. I'm going to just talk about a couple more problems with our systems before I talk a little bit more about the education piece. So most people think that elected officials, their elected officials, do not represent them. And yet they keep re-electing them. So people say the politicians don't know the common person. The politicians in Washington are all about the moneyed interests. The political parties are run by folks with money. They're not really talking to, for me, the common person. This quote from a Pennsylvania state legislator, I think, really wraps this up in terms of what's going on here. He said, "It's a shame that people are trying to persuade my position on the project by threatening me with their vote. In my opinion, that is as corrupt as trying to bribe me with money." He's running for re-election. Research shows that there's a correlation between public policies that are put into effect, that are enacted, and the preferences of special interests and money interests. Research also shows that there's no correlation between the preferences of the majority, the common good, and what gets enacted into law. So something's not working right in our democracy. And yet, in 2014, with an approval rating of 14%, 96% of congressional members running for re-election got re-elected. The framers of our Constitution expected our government officials to be part-time. They expected Congress, for example, to be in session about 6 months a year. The pay, given in today's dollars, was about $1,500. Congressmen were going to go back to their profession and make their real money, and it was a part-time position. Today, Congress is in session about 11 months. Base pay, $174,000. Really good benefits, excellent health care, really good retirement plan, free haircuts, a gym to work out in. This is a good job. Who doesn't want a career in that kind of a job? But it may not be serving us the way it is supposed to be. And there are those who would argue about term limits, preventing this career politician. and research is mixed on the impact of term limits. Mercy Otis Warren, who was a peer of Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson, you probably don't know much about Mercy Otis Warren. She was a woman who was very involved in the political conversations of her day, from the Declaration on through to the Constitution. You probably don't know much about her because she was a woman at a time when politicians, women were not supposed to be involved in politics. But she was also on the losing side of the Constitution. She was an anti-federalist. She was concerned that the Constitution gave the government too much power, not enough for the people. Mercy Otis Warren said, "No republic ever yet stood on a stable foundation without satisfying the common people. How is this done when so few people vote?" Very few people participate in what is seen as the most basic way to participate in our politics, which is voting. Since 1972, the average voter turnout during presidential election years is 56%. And that's the highest years for turnout. For young voters, so those folks who are coming up, who are going to replace some of those older voters, the turnout since 1972, when they really first got the right to vote, is about 44% on average. In the midterm elections, still federal election years, but the president's not on the ballot, turnout on average from 72 is about 39%. And at the government level, the governments that do the most for us on a daily basis, our local governments, state governments, when those elections are held in the off years, the odd-numbered years, when there's no federal folks on the ballot, turnout is between 25 and 30%. So people are not voting. Even those who do vote don't know a lot about what they're voting on. Typically, they go to the ballot and may not even know the names of the candidates, don't know the policies of the candidates. Even if an incumbent is running, they may not know the name until they see it on the ballot. This presidential election year, I think most people know at least who's running for president, Democrat and Republican at least. They may not know the third-party candidates. But do people really know what the policy positions are of those candidates? Are the candidates giving us the information we need? Are we finding the information we need in an objective way on the internet? How do people vote when they don't know the candidates or their positions? Have you ever gone into a polling place to vote and you didn't know names or positions? How do you vote? Party line. Party line is the fallback, and more people are voting party line. Even independents tend to stay with one or the other party. So party line voting is occurring. Unfortunately, Americans are pretty politically illiterate. Voters are factually challenged when it comes to the political process. In 2012, only 21% of 18 to 29-year-olds knew their state's voter registration deadline. So you need to register to vote, and if you don't know the deadline, you may miss it. Matter of fact, Donald Trump's children in New York primary last year missed the deadline. They couldn't vote for their father, who was running for president. Huge problem. A poll of college seniors found that the average score on a civic literacy test, college seniors, average score on a civic literacy test, 50%. That's an F. In the summer of 2015, 60% of college graduates didn't know how the Constitution was amended. Only about 40% didn't know that Congress declares war. And nearly half could not identify the term of office for folks elected to the US House or to the US Senate. And whether or not they knew the number in the House is questionable. Gallup poll in 2013 found that 35% of poll respondents didn't know the name of their Congress representatives. 1/3 of US citizens who take the naturalization test, immigrants who want to become citizens take this test as part of their process, 1/3 of Americans fail it. 90% of immigrants pass it. We clearly have a problem with civic education. Our schools have really focused much more recently on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Now we're hearing people talk about STEAM adding the arts in there, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. But we really have lost civic education from kindergarten on up through college. Former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor observed in 2010, half of the states no longer make civics a requirement to get out of high school. She describes this as a remarkable withdrawal from the very purpose we had originally for public schools. We need politically literate citizens for a healthy democracy. Citizens who understand the problems of our political system, citizens who understand how to affect policymakers, and citizens who vote regularly so elected officials are held accountable to the common good, to the citizens. So civic education from kindergarten through college, I think, is step one to fix many of the problems in our political system. So what does civic education look like? More and more there are studies done and people pushing for increased civic education. They talk about certain knowledge that our students, our young people need, certain skills, as well as certain dispositions. In terms of knowledge, what knowledge needs to be taught? They need to know the basics of political institutions, the structures of government, the processes of government, how bills become law. They need to know when to register to vote, how to vote, if their state has early voting. They need to know how to gain access to elected officials and how to be able to influence them, persuade them, even if they don't have a lot of money to share with their campaign funds. They also need to know why we have polarization. What are the values that lead to different and diverse ideologies, and how long is this polarization going to last? Is there hope? So they need to have some of this information in order for them to be active, engaged, and educated citizens. They also have to talk about current political controversies in the classroom. Lots of times, if we do that in the classroom, people are afraid faculty will be seen as partisan. But if we don't engage citizens, our students, talking about current issues and in an objective way and the foundations of that, then they're not going to be able to participate in an educated way, a critically thinking way. And so those are some of the skills we need for our students. Critical thinking. They need to be able to analyze data. They need to be able to collect it from multiple sources and compare it and find out what is good data on the internet and elsewhere. They need to be able to deliberate, build bridges working with people who think differently than they do. They need to be able to collaborate, communicate in writing and orally and also using media. They need to be able to navigate the political system and their communities. They need to do that when they're students. They need to practice those skills through classes and other activities. What dispositions need to be fostered through socialization in general, and education is clearly a part of that. We need young people to have a respect for freedom and dignity, objectivity, know what that is, empathy, tolerance, open-mindedness, some would say a social justice mindedness. Lots of work to be done in education. When I have education majors taking my state and local government class because it's required for them, they come in, the education majors come in scared. They feel like they know nothing about politics, they're afraid of politics. One of the things they have to do for me is they have to attend 2 local government meetings, and I give them a series of questions, about a dozen questions, that they're going to use to analyze what's going on at that meeting. And the questions are grounded in what they've learned in the classroom about representative democracy, about processes, open meeting laws. And so they have to observe and compare at least 2 different local governments and how they function to what it's supposed to look like. And at the end of the semester, when I ask an open-ended question, what's the most important thing you learned this semester? The education majors say that I can participate in politics and I need to. And as an education major, they're going to pass that on to their communities and their students. So I think that's really important. In 1820, Thomas Jefferson said, "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power." So yes, our political system maybe on life support. But we need civic education in order to get it off of life support, get it into recovery, and hopefully move it to the point where it can help all Americans fulfill the American dream. Thank you.